event today. This is, I think, a very powerful opportunity for us to explore the theme that we've used this year for Women's History Month. This year we said we want to recognize that we control the future. We make the future by the decisions that we make today. But in order to make those decisions in an intelligent way, we need to look to our past. We need to see what happened before us. We may decide, well, some of that's okay, let's continue it. We may also look to some of it and say, never, never again. And I think today's presentation is one of those never, never again phenomenon. So I am thrilled to see you here. I'm going to introduce Dr. Laban Rashlian, who will introduce our speakers for today, and thank you again for coming.
Thank you all for coming. This, as Professor Renner said, is a very important topic. And when we talk about genocide, if I introduce the guest speakers, I want to emphasize something. Before we talk about genocide, I always like to emphasize that genocides are committed, ordered by governments or government officials, authorities, and civilians. Many civilians do participate in the killing and the destruction, but the main responsibility has to be placed on the government. And in the case of the Armenian Genocide, same thing. The Turkish Ottoman government ordered the genocide, organized it. Many civilians, individuals participated, but the fault, the responsibility rests with the government. So I want to emphasize just an important fact that at the same time that Ottoman Turkish soldiers, government officials, and individuals are doing the killing, at the same time there were Turks who were protecting Armenians, saving Armenians. And one example is Senator Ahmet Riza, who 1915 December in the parliament, the Ottoman Turkish parliament, he declared that it is unlawful to do this to Armenians, it is unlawful to seize their properties, and he said specifically that it is unlawful to designate Armenian properties as being abandoned. Nobody can sell my property if I don't want to sell it. And he said that it is unconscionable for the government to do things like this. He is a Turkish senator speaking in the Turkish parliament, Ottoman parliament, December 1915. Another example is that the Sharif of Mecca issued in 1917 an order directing that Arabs and Turks protect Armenians. While the Ottoman government is ordering the destruction of Armenians, the Sharif of Mecca is ordering to protect Armenians. One final example is the director of the Red Crescent. The Red Crescent is equivalent of the Red Cross. We all know what the Red Cross is. The director of the Red Crescent in one area inside the Ottoman Empire, in what is today central Turkey, he took in huge numbers of Armenians into his hospital, into his area, and he protected them as much as he could. We know in the case of the Holocaust, there's someone named Schindler. Maybe some of you have seen the film Schindler's List. Maybe that director of the Red Crescent can be viewed as a Turkish Schindler. So always keep that in mind when we study genocide, to distinguish between the government and the common people, many of whom are opposed to the government, and many Armenians who are alive, who stayed alive, was thanks to Turks, Arabs who helped them. Okay, with that, I want to introduce our speakers today, very shortly because they have a lot to say. I already took some of their time. Doris and Arda Melkonian, they are graduate students, PhD candidates at UCLA, and they specialize in studying oral history testimonies. They've gone through, I don't know how many they've gone through. And they've heard so many first-hand accounts. They now also are connected as research assistants. They are also connected with the Shoah Foundation at USC. It's an interesting combination. Having one foot at UCLA, 1 foot at USC. It's not. It's an interesting combination, isn't it? The Shoah Foundation has a collection. Maybe they'll explain it. It has a collection of Armenian oral history testimonies. So with that, let me introduce Doris and Arda Melkonian.
Before we begin, we wanted to thank the Women's History Month Committee and the Armenian Genocide Centennial Committee for inviting us here today. This is a very dear topic to us, and like Professor Maralsyan said, we have been working on the survivor testimonies for years. We've gone through maybe 400 plus testimonies within the UCLA collection. So today what we're going to do is highlight some of the things that they have said and present their voices and discuss it in our paper. All right. A century after the Armenian Genocide, scholars and the Armenian communities at large continue to be captivated by this horrific event in modern history, devoting countless hours and considerable energy researching and commemorating it. Accounts of the atrocities carried out against the Armenians by the Young Turks, stories of death and torture, and narratives of the survival have been presented primarily through the lens of male survivors. Most of the body of the literature on the Armenian Genocide is about the men, their struggles, and their experiences. Few studies have focused on the survival experiences of females, despite the fact that a higher percentage of survivors were women and children. The focus of our presentation today highlights the experiences of women and the role they played in their personal survival as well as the survival of their loved ones. Memories of the genocide survivors, both male and female, are examined, and their accounts about the female family members are used to capture the privilege women's experiences.
So for our methodology, let's just explain how we did our study. The survivor testimonies that we're using for this paper are from the UCLA Armenian Genocide Oral History Collection. In the 1970s and 80s, Professor Hovhannisyan and his students collected interviews of genocide survivors. There are over 800 survivor testimonies, and we used that collection for this study. Just to give you a little bit a background about oral history and the value that this brings to the study of history and events like genocides and Holocaust. First-person accounts by survivors provide valuable information about the genocide. Yehuda Bauer, who is a famous Holocaust historian, says that above all, we need the witness. There is no history without witnesses. Through survivor testimonies, we acquire a thorough understanding of the horrors of genocide. Professor Richard Hovhannisyan has said that eyewitness accounts may be as valuable as official dispatches and reports. It is in such versions especially that the human element becomes manifest, affording insights not to be found in documents. And another scholar, Holocaust scholar, Samuel Totens, has said, first-person accounts by victims and others are capable of breaking through the numbing mass of numbers in that they provide the thoughts, the passions, and the voices of those who experienced and or witnessed the terrible calamity now referred to as genocide. And while first-person accounts serve many purposes, among the most significant is the fact that authentic accounts constitute valuable testimony as to what it means to be caught up in the maelstrom of hatred and savagery that is genocide. Through these testimonies, we gain insights about the terror of genocide as told by those who lived and suffered through it. And as we read these accounts, we realize that the victims are human beings like us, whose lives were abruptly disrupted by unspeakable brutality.
So why gender analysis? Gender analysis of the Armenian Genocide involves the re-examination of the event using a gender lens in order to enhance our understanding. Its goal is to draw attention to the role gender played in the lives and deaths of men and women during the genocide. The term gender is used to refer to societal definitions and expectations of what it means to be a male or female. A study of gender attempts to depict the interactions between racism and sexism during the genocide. Clearly, male and female Armenians were treated differently. They were not similarly victimized. Their experiences varied because of their sex. The consensus is that gender did matter. Being a male or female to a large extent determined the nature and level of harassment. Often the suffering of Armenian women was compounded because of their sex. They were victimized both as women and as Armenians. Therefore, the intersection of racism and sexism, the complex relationship between these two forms of oppressions, need to be explored. The Turks' genocidal plans differed for men and women. It is well known that the first stage of the Armenian Genocide was to round up the men and kill them, because they were perceived as the greater threat. The initial assault, focused and vigorous, was directed toward the murder of Armenian men rather than women. Undoubtedly, gender determined the ways that Armenians were persecuted. While the plan of the Ottoman Turks was the extermination of all Armenians, both men and women, but the strategies they used to accomplish this goal were gender-specific. Also important to examine are differences in reactions and strategies of survival between men and women. How did women cope with their circumstances? What specific vulnerabilities did they possess? What are some unique gender-related resources available for women that help them in their struggle to survive? Finally, gender-related analysis is not an attempt to privilege the experiences or suffering of Armenian women over that of Armenian men. Rather, it is an acknowledgement that men and women experienced the genocide differently, and it is an attempt to highlight the differences that existed. This type of analysis will enhance our knowledge of the genocide, generating a richer and deeper understanding of the event. It will provide increased awareness of the experiences of Armenian women during the genocide.
Boss, a well-known scholar, insists that research on gendered experiences is relevant and important, and suggests that narrative and discourse must be critically examined to acquire an understanding of the interaction between gender, experience, and history. When we come across gender differences in survivor narratives, we need to question how these are relevant. How do they come about? What do they mean? How should we interpret these narratives? Gender analysis, according to Boss, must be taken into account different ways in which men and female survivors create meaning. She suggests that this occurs in 3 ways. Survivors select certain experiences to share. They remember or choose to remember only certain experiences, and they choose a specific way of telling. All of these choices are affected by an individual's gender. Boss emphasizes that men and women experience, remember, and recount the same treatment or events differently. Recognition of this reality has important consequences for historical research. If the memories of men and women are different, and if we have been relying primarily on male testimonies of historical events, how is our perception of these experiences incorrect or incomplete? This underscores the importance of taking women's testimonies into account. When examining survivor memoirs, a more critical approach is needed, which recognizes that these are gendered discourses which serve to construct, reshape, and contest the memory of the past for various purposes, as much as they serve to preserve the past. This is one of the main reasons we privilege the voices of women in our presentations, since men and women speak differently about experiences. In another paper, we look more closely at the language differences, different ways and the different words that men and women use. We won't be able to get into that today, but that's another interesting area of how men and women describe things differently and use different words, different language to describe events.
This study will examine the narratives of survivors to catalog the ways women were treated and the ways they responded. Among Holocaust scholars, Ringelheim was one of the first scholars to explore gender differences during the Holocaust. Ringelheim proposes a useful framework for analyzing gender differences during the Holocaust. She categorizes these differences into two groups: women's vulnerabilities, that is what was done to them, women's sufferings, ways that women suffered, and second, women's resources, what did they do? Women's surviving, ways that they ensured their survival and the survival of their loved ones. Using this framework to group women's stories, we hope to bring to light themes that are unique to women's experiences and their responses as they responded to the horrors of the genocide. So for today, we have our framework up. We have vulnerabilities, the sufferings, what was done to them, and under that category we have pregnancy, kidnapping, and rape. In the resourceful category, or surviving and succeeding, what did the women do? We have broken it down to creating bonds, nurturing children, marriage, and skills. So for our first category under vulnerabilities, we wanted to discuss the suffering of women. While both men and women suffered during the genocide, women's vulnerabilities differed from those of men because of their biological attributes. Not surprisingly, women's sexuality and their reproductive capabilities made them especially vulnerable. As many of you know, during the Armenian Genocide, the able-bodied men were rounded up, usually at night, taken away. Some were taken to work on roads, others were tortured, beaten, and killed. Afterwards, women and children were forced out of their homes and deported. Most of the sexual violence took place during the deportations. The deportees were regularly beaten, kidnapped, or sexually abused by their guards or by the local men of the villages through which they passed. We wanted to examine three categories of suffering. We have kidnapping, pregnancy, and rape. So during the genocide, the reproductive capabilities of the victim group was targeted. This was true of the Armenian Genocide as well. Pregnancy and childbirth during the genocide made Armenian women even more vulnerable to attack. Often, pregnant women were targeted for additional physical violence. Childbirth, the act of giving life, resulted in the death of the mother. One example of the increased risk faced by pregnant women is recounted by Moses. In the excerpt up on the screen, we see how he recounts about one pregnant woman who was brutalized by soldiers and left to die. Moses remembers, "There were soldiers all around us. One of the girls said that she could no longer walk. She was pregnant. She fell into labor and had no choice. They beat her with a cane and pushed her on. They stuck her with their guns and pushed her on. When they arrived at the edge of the town, she was with her grandmother, mother, little sister, and her elder brother. She, who could no longer walk, wanted some water again. They kicked her, ripped her belly open with their swords, abandoned her, and left.
In our next category of kidnapping, we read that during the death marches, many Armenian women and girls were abducted and forced into marriage with their captors. Some of the kidnapped women were killed, many were raped, and others were forced to marry their kidnappers. Those who resisted the kidnapping attempts were often killed. Several survivors tell stories of Turks grabbing women and taking them away to be their so-called wives. The young girls went on the road and the Turks took them. They would take them and make them their wives. They even took my sister. In the following example, John Barsemyan shares how his 5 cousins were kidnapped, married to Turks, had children, and never returned. He says, well, during the war, you know how it was. They just confiscated the girls. All my 5 cousins, my aunt's daughters. Youngest was quite small at the time, but all the other 4 were taken by force and they remained there. Women were also subjected to rape. Gender-specific crimes exist in genocide. Men and women are tortured in different ways and die different deaths. The means to destroying a group tends to be gender differentiated, based on physical differences between men and women, and also on the meanings associated with the male and female bodies. Men are usually abducted, tortured, and killed, while women, as symbols of the nation, are raped. They are targeted not only because of their membership in the victim group, but because they are necessary to its continuation. So in order to destroy the community, women must be destroyed or appropriated. During the Armenian Genocide, rape was widespread. While both men and women were subjected to brutalities, women were often violated in ways that men were not. And many of these brutalities were sex-specific, related to their sexual and reproductive capacities. While rape was the norm on the death marches, sexual assault during the Armenian Genocide seems to have little tactical or strategic purpose. Since very little is known about the intention of the top-level Ottoman leadership, as well as those of local individuals who practice sexual violence, it is difficult to determine their goals. However, it is not unreasonable to assume that the perpetrators of sexual violence had motives similar to those of other genocide perpetrators, which include a desire for total domination, demonstrations of masculinity in the case of gang rapes, and humiliation, intimidation, and dehumanization of not only the victim, but the victim's relatives and of Armenians overall.
So what we would like to do right now is show a video of 2 survivors who were interviewed by Dr. J. Michael Hagopian, and they discussed their experiences. The first one is in English. The second one is in Armenian, but with subtitles. So we're going to play this, and then we'll get back to our presentation.
Knocked our doors and key away with them. And they put us in a boxcar. The train took us as far as Afyonkarahisar. From there again on the train, and we went all the way somewhere near Konya in the interior of Turkey. There were many exiles from different cities of Turkey. We had to, I saw with my own eyes, Purova from Bach. She couldn't walk there. They throw her into the burning fire. My father's first cousin, Hagopian, lost his mind in front of us. Then We were supposed to be the fortunate ones. Then we went, they put us on train again towards the Syrian desert. From there on, we had to walk again. We have been on the road for 5 months since we left Bandarma. Just walking, you know, it was a death march. There were bodies all around us on the bed, on the side. I saw with my eyes a pregnant woman among us, and because she was lagging, you know, the Turkish soldiers put the sword on her stomach, and the baby came out of her. And the mother died there too, right there. We were at the top of the mountain, and nobody was talking. They were all silent. Dead bodies all around us, you know, both sides. They won't let us bury our dear ones. We had to walk on continually. That march was like a column of ants or a huge caterpillar walking and walking slowly. They all knew they were going to die.
Çeçenler böyle yaptı. Karı, kız, avrat, ne, hepsine Çağırırını çağır, diler ammen çağır, itmesi mamute. Amtoxtu, benik nedin zerkeri, kodratın panırı, verdik nini çeşini, itmesi yapın. Anche se a me, preso ancora a me, non tengo, io fanno a me non tornate, sentiamo a me non tornate. Anche se il collega ha un po', io ho avuto che battuti, e ci vorranno tutti in asa, ci battuti, ed è un po' bulan. Annemin gitmekti.
Virgin child married.
Amen hakusnyen paneli arı hiç matmeçimine at kişer at honca anak gel baktı olurdu var getap çocuk var getap.
Virgin child married.
Puhta olurdu marketin lemensa. Lemensa nayetan por kaçmesan. Kaçmesan doğru ammenlerin honca. Ampok branurus kolokni içmeli pan aruk. Mochtuna tovneri elankmıştan askerli çıbartmış arunu müret anıktızları mutpanının megalo ego ekvarımlı.
The interviewing must continue.
Bana yüreğim.
Some survivors bring new questions, fresh insight, or valuable interpretations.
It's very emotional to watch these clips, and we're glad that Professor Marashian suggested that we show these clips, because it's one thing to read their words and to hear their words, but it's another thing to watch their expressions and the emotions they experience while they're retelling these stories.
Some of you maybe didn't understand the second interviewee. She was talking first in Turkish, and then she started talking in Armenian. And you can tell that she was struggling to recount the suffering that they experienced. She wanted to talk about the rape the women experienced, but oftentimes the women will not use the word rape. They will use euphemisms. And she was saying it's shameful, meaning she can't discuss that they were being raped and tortured. But despite the suffering and the torture these women experienced, they somehow found the courage and the resilience to survive and rebuild the Armenian community, the Armenian people, the Armenian home. So we wanted to move on to the resourcefulness of women, how they survived and succeeded these atrocities, and how they rebuilt their lives, rebuilding the Armenian home, the community, and moving ahead. So often in the context of violent conflicts, women's victimhood is presented, but not women's agency. These were ordinary women who behaved in extraordinary ways to ensure the survival of their families and their ethnic group. In circumstances that may have seemed hopeless, they manipulated the resources available to them in order to survive. One of the survivors, Bedros, discusses how his aunt married a Turk in order to save the family. He recounts, "My aunt was not married, but a young woman. My aunt that went to Adana or Cyprus, there were people from America that came to get married. And over there was a shoemaker named Hajilian, and they agreed with my aunt to get married to go to America. And my sister was with her, and my aunt took her too as her child." So we see that these women are using marriage in order not only to survive themselves, but to help their family members, their children, their sisters, brothers survive.
And we also see that they are creating bonds. So they're using their skills of nurturing and caring to form bonds that allow them to survive and others to survive. During the deportation, many families were left fragmented. So in the attempt to survive, individuals joined forces with other relatives, with their grandmothers, stepmothers, aunts, cousins, and so on, to help each other through. John Barsamian shares a personal experience. He was a recipient of such caring by his cousins, his aunt's daughters. He recalls how his two cousins, who were taken into harems, took care of him and his mother by providing work for them. He says, "My aunt's daughters were confiscated and converted and taken in the harems. They had taken their husbands, forced their husbands. They had taken all our property again, you see, and they were using the houses. My cousins managed with their husbands in such a way that we would go and work for them. My mother used to go every day, summer and winter, to go there and make bread, to work for them in the field, to do anything you see, and in the evening they would give as much as they would like in order to feed us." We have examples of other individuals who took care of siblings, took care of cousins. Hagop Boyajan recalls how two sisters took care of him during the deportation when he had no one to nurture him. The women gathered their resources to provide homes for the orphan children. He says, "I reached the tents, and what do I see? The entire caravan was there. All the women there were my mother's relatives, and I recognized them. There were two sisters, and they told me to stay with them. They were older girls. They said, 'You stay with us, and we will take care of you.'" Another strategy that women used were to nurture their children. Mothers played an important role in the survival of their children. Since loyalty and dedication to the family is a core Armenian value, women sacrificed themselves for the sake of their children. Some women refused to abandon their children, even if it meant saving themselves. In other situations, mothers faced a difficult choice. Aware of the dangers awaiting them, some women had to choose whether to take their children along or leave them behind. Some mothers made the difficult decision to protect the lives of their children by leaving them behind in the care of others.
In the following example, we see Garabet, who recalls instances of mothers giving their children to strangers so that the child at least will be survived, knowing that by going on the death march, they will most probably die. So Garabet recalls, at the time, the Arabs were walking inside the Khan. I don't know what one of them told my mother, but she agreed and convinced me to go with him. She said, "My son, we will die, but at least you will survive, and life will somehow go on." The Arab took hold of my arm, and putting a few pieces of candy into my pocket, we went. Another survivor discusses how her mother left her in the care of their Turkish neighbor. Nazeli recalls that there were Turkish neighbors who convinced her mother to leave her behind, promising her mother that they will nurture her and take care of her, and when the mother returns, they will return the child to her. So Nazeli says, "The soldiers came into our homes. I was 12 years old since I was born in 1904. One of our Turkish neighbors told my mother, 'Let Nazeli stay here. When you come back, I'll return her to you, and if not, we'll raise her.' I was a small child, and everyone loved me. All Armenians from the village had gathered by the trees before being deported. I did not want to stay and wanted to go with my mother. I brought a blanket with me and put it on my shoulders and cried, but they closed the door on me, and I stayed inside the house. After crying for a while, I slept, and when I woke up, there was no one in the house. Our Turkish neighbors came and took me to their house. I lived in their house for 5 or 6 years, but they took good care of me."
Survivors share stories of women using marriage as a form of protection. We have examples of women who make the decision to marry Turks in order to protect their families. Often in the testimonies, we hear that women view this as a sacrifice they must make to save the lives of their family members. Sarkis recalls that a woman married a Turk in order to help her family and protect them from the killings and the deportation. He says, "She was the first Armenian girl who married a Turk. They had said, 'Marry him to save the lives of your parents.'" And we have Armanush, who tells of how her mother married her and her sister at a very young age so that they would have protectors. She says, "I grew up and my mother married me to this man. I was 15 years old. I married whoever my mother told me to. My sister was 13 when my mother gave her to some other man. If she hadn't, my sister would have been taken by the Turks. We married our little girl at 12 because we were afraid that the Turks would take her."
Our next category is skills and what skills women use to survive. Women also use the skills that they had in their gender-specific roles within the house to provide for their families. They relied on their skills in embroidery, knitting, and sewing to support their families financially during and after the deportations. When the men were unable to fulfill their traditional gender roles of providing for their families, women were forced to take on special roles of breadwinner, working as seamstresses, gardeners, servants, and bakers. Women whose traditional roles were limited to caring and nurturing for the family found that their responsibilities had increased. Haruchun recalls the following: "My mother would do beautiful needlework. A Turkish girl came one day and asked if we had anything to sell. My mother said, 'Yes. If you bring me thread, I will sew you a dantel,' which is embroidery. 'I will bring it,' she said. She went and brought thread, and my mother sewed a dantel, a doily, And this girl went crazy. She started to kiss my mother's face. And in this way, Haru Chun's mother was able to support her family. Mari recalls that her mother continued working at the American factory sewing clothes when they arrived in Beirut. She says she was a natural seamstress. The church in Antillia served as the orphanage, and my mother worked as a seamstress there, sewing shirts and aprons for the girls, and I don't know what else. Of course, it wasn't just my mother. Other women worked there too. And finally, Pedro says the missionaries played an important role in the survival of women and children during the genocide. He recalls the missionaries were from every nationality. And because of this, my aunt was a teacher in the Bethel orphanage in Syria. She was vice principal. She took my sister from the village to get an education. Hagop says, my mother worked to support us. We used to have a maid who would come and work for my mother, but now my mother went and worked as a servant for others. She was a servant for others and did their work, and therefore she didn't remarry. She took care of us and raised us. We see that Armenian women use their skills, utilizing their resources as much as they could to ensure the survival of their loved ones.
So, in this presentation, we attempted to draw attention to the role of gender in the lives and deaths of women during the Armenian Genocide. We sought to highlight the unique suffering experienced by women and their reactions to persecution and the strategies they used for survival.
We're about to finish, but we would like to acknowledge and thank the following individuals and organizations. We wanted to thank the Women's History Month and Armenian Genocide Centennial Commemoration Committees for inviting us here today to share and give voice to the survivors of the Armenian Genocide. We would like to thank Professor Levon Marashian, who invited us to present today, and also for sharing the clips that you saw. We would also like to acknowledge our own professor, Professor Hovanesyan, who did a monumental job of collecting and documenting the stories of the survivors. There are over 800 in the collection at UCLA. And Dr. Ruben Adalyan, who is director of the Armenian National Institute, who has collected some of the pictures that we use today in our presentation. And finally, we would like to thank you for coming and listening to our presentation and being part of this commemoration of the Armenian Genocide, 100th anniversary of the Armenian Genocide.
I want to make an announcement about future events, but let's thank our...
Okay, thank you.
You can talk to them, of course, after the event for a few minutes. I just want to announce that you got these flyers for the future events. The next lecture will be April 2, and it will be about the Armenian Genocide in literature. And there will be two speakers. One is Professor Keshishan back there, just sort of asking a question. Next time he'll be up here speaking to you. And Dr. Rubina Perumian will also be talking about how the Armenian Genocide has been presented in literature, in English language and in Armenian language literature. And on April 7, there's an event on comparative genocide, or genocides in context. And speakers, there will be, the moderator will be Robin Fishman, and Roger Bowerman will be speaking about Native Americans, and Elizabeth Crombeck will be speaking about the pseudoscience of creating a master race and the Holocaust. And Father Vazgen Movsesian will be speaking about, he has an interesting title, The Link Between the Rwandan and Armenian Genocides. There's a link between these two genocides. And there are other events, and we hope to see you at these future lectures and programs. Thank you all for coming. And thank you.